you for standing by. Welcome to the first ever HIV Positive Living Kidney Donor Conference call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, we'll conduct a question-and-answer session. Instructions will be given at that time. Should you require assistance during the call, please press star, then 0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. I'd like to now turn the conference over to our host, Dr. Aubrey Wong. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Audrey Wong, Director of Media Relations at Johns Hopkins Medicine. With me today are Ms. Nina Martinez, a hero in my book, who earlier this
Dr.
week...
Wong, your line may be muted.
A hero in my book who earlier this week donated a kidney to an anonymous recipient. Now, you may be asking yourself why that's so remarkable, and the reason is that Nina has been living with HIV for most of her life. And until 2013, when the HIV Organ Policy Equity, or HOPE Act, was passed, allowing for organ donation between those living with HIV, Nina and others living with HIV were prevented from being living or deceased organ donors. But as of this week, Nina is the first ever person living with HIV to donate a kidney to a recipient also living with HIV. So congratulations and thank you so much for wanting to share your story. To Nina's left is Dr. Christine Duran, Associate Professor of Medicine and Oncology here at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, whose work focuses on people living with hepatitis C or HIV who also require cancer therapies or solid organ transplant therapies. And in particular, since this type of transplant for these types of patients are so new, Dr. Duran is very interested in learning the long-term outcomes of these donations to better understand survival, organ function, rejection, as well as virus levels and the overall safety of these transplants. And with us on the end, Dr. Dori Segev, the Marjorie K. and Thomas Pozefsky Professor of Surgery and Epidemiology and Associate Vice Chair of the Department of Surgery at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and Director of the Epidemiology Research Group in Organ Transplantation at the Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Segev led the surgical team that performed Nina's surgery this week, which was made possible by his hard work in crafting and pushing through the HOPE Act. Thank you all for making the time to tell us about this historic surgery. First, I'll ask each of you to say a few words, then we'll open it up to questions from journalists. We will start with Dr. Segev on the end.
Okay, thank you. So today we're celebrating the first time ever in the world that somebody with HIV donated a kidney to somebody else who needed a transplant. Why was this never done anywhere else before? Was because there were two limitations two barriers keeping us from doing this. The first barrier was legal, and the second barrier was medical. So, as you heard, before 2013, people with HIV were not allowed to be organ donors, whether deceased or living. In 2010, we started becoming interested in this because we saw that there were people on the transplant list who had HIV who were dying. And at the same time, we were unable to use organs from donors who were available who had HIV. So we did the research necessary to understand how this could be safe, and we wrote the HOPE Act and got the HOPE Act passed in 2013. And then 2 years ago, actually 3 years ago, we were able to do the first deceased donor HIV-to-HIV transplants. With the legal barrier lifted, it then made sense to start thinking about, can we do living donor transplants? Well, the medical side of a living donor transplant is we want to make sure that the donor remains healthy for the rest of their life and can live their long and healthy life with only one kidney. In the context of HIV, this was thought to be potentially risky because historically, HIV itself was associated with kidney disease, so HIV itself would harm the kidney, and the antiretroviral therapy, the ART, that patients with HIV were taking also had toxicity on the kidney. So the HIV itself and the medication to suppress the HIV would potentially harm the kidney. But we hypothesized that in the modern era, this might be better, and that the safety of patients living with HIV and their kidneys might have been improved. So we did a study of more than 40,000 people living with HIV, and we looked at the impact of HIV, HIV control, other medications, etc., on the risk of kidney disease in people living with HIV. And we found that actually, if you have HIV that's well controlled, in the modern era of antiretroviral therapy, it's actually safe to donate a kidney, and your long-term risks of kidney disease after donation are quite low. Nina contacted us after she heard about this research that we did and said, you know, I would love to be the first HIV positive living kidney donor. And so we started the screening process to make sure that she was healthy enough to donate. She donated her kidney earlier this week, and as you can see, everything went exceptionally well, and she's ready to leave the hospital today. So we're all very excited about this. For us, this is not only a celebration of transplantation, but a celebration of the progress of HIV care and the fact that 30 years ago, what was a disease that was basically a death sentence has been so transformed that today somebody with HIV can save somebody else's life.
Amazing, amazing. Dr. Duran, do you have a few words to share?
Absolutely. So this is an exciting day for us. My name is Christine Durand. I'm a transplant infectious disease and HIV physician. So along with Dr. Segev, I've been working for several years now on the Hope and Action studies, along with a tremendous team. And we have been doing HIV-to-HIV deceased donor transplants. But there was caution about moving forward with the first in the world living donor transplant. We wanted to be sure that it would be safe for someone living with HIV to donate a kidney. And once Dr. Segev's group did that work and we realized that the risk was low and the risk was acceptable, we just needed to wait for the right donor. Fortunately, Nina found us, and as you'll hear, her story of courage has really flipped the script for those living with HIV. So what were we looking for in an ideal donor? First of all, they needed to be healthy, and Nina is literally a marathon runner. They needed to have well-controlled HIV. Nina's HIV is under excellent control, and she has essentially a normal immune system. So otherwise, it was business as usual in terms of evaluating for a standard living donor transplant. The other thing we had to consider was what we call HIV superinfection. And what that means is that the recipient will very likely be infected with the donor's virus as well. People ask what's the clinical significance of superinfection. It really just means that we need to carefully pay attention to HIV drug resistance. So people living with HIV can acquire some resistance to some of the medications over years of infection, and we need to take that into account. Essentially, we need to make sure that the recipient's HIV medications will work against the recipient and donor's virus. So in Nina's case, she has almost no HIV resistance, and it was very straightforward, very simple. So the transplant went well. The recipient is doing beautifully and is incredibly grateful for this gift. And now we just monitor for the long-term outcomes. I think based on the work that our group did, we expect that Nina will have excellent outcomes and that the risk of developing kidney disease in the long term is very low. And I think the more exciting thing about this milestone is that it really changes the narrative about HIV, and we know there are many people living with HIV who will see this as a breakthrough and a victory, that they will have the opportunity to potentially donate to help a loved one, help a friend. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Nina, we're dying to hear your story.
Well, actually, having borne witness to somebody who did donate a kidney is sort of how I started on this path. When the HOPE Act was passed in 2013, I have to admit I wasn't really excited about it because we were talking about, it was permitting people living with HIV to donate their organs upon death, and I was 30 at the time, and so death wasn't something that I was thinking about, having grown up with HIV. But what happened was, shortly after the HOPE Act was passed, I saw a storyline on Grey's Anatomy where they did have a living HIV-to-HIV kidney transplant, and in the back of my mind, that sort of planted the idea in my head. And a year later, after that episode aired, a neighbor of mine donated a kidney, and I thought to myself, I'm probably just as healthy as that neighbor of mine, and this is something that I would like to do. I was just waiting for, Hopkins to carry out the science that they needed to do so that I could make my medical decision. But honestly, it was something that stayed with me, and in earnest, the opportunity didn't come until I had a friend express that he needed a kidney, and it was a general ask of anybody, HIV positive or HIV negative. But when I knew somebody who needed a kidney, it just prompted me to do an internet search, and that's how I found out that Johns Hopkins had been approved as the first center to attempt living HIV-to-HIV kidney transplants. And I eagerly contacted them, and I'm a longtime clinical research volunteer, so I feel like the last 15 years I have been training for this clinical research marathon, and I knew that I was the one that they had been waiting for, and went through the evaluations and was just released from the hospital, so I'm very excited to be here.
Great. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. It's good to get this good news day for the community, because there are a lot of intractable problems with HIV, and this, when my friend just asked for a kidney, is a really simple solution empirically, so I was very glad to do this.
Excellent.
I feel good about it.
Thank you so much for doing so. So should we start with questions on the phone? Deja, do you have any questions for us?
And ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press star and then 1 on your touch tone phone. Again, please press star and then 1 for any questions.
And those of you watching on Periscope, you're also welcome to submit questions just by typing them in. Thank you.
And just so you know, there are no questions on the phone lines at the moment. But again, if you do have a question, please press star and then 1.
Okay, so we have a question here that was submitted earlier from reporters. Nina, what were your thoughts on the morning of the surgery? I know this was something that you had been thinking about for a long time. There were a lot of appointments in advance and some screening and all that. So you had a lot of time to really think about the day of surgery.
I mean, honestly, all I was thinking was I get to take a really great nap after nearly 9 months of appointments and tests, that the easy part was ahead of me. I think there's a lot of, especially with donors who are being evaluated, there are a lot of phases of testing, and it could fall through at any time. So to get to the finish line, to have it in my sights, it was quite an immense relief. And honestly, all I had to do was just lay there. So
Great. Yeah. They did all the hard work.
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Durant, you mentioned the possibility of superinfection. How many different strains of HIV are there in the patient population? And are there some that are more dangerous, I guess, than others?
So worldwide, there are several different subtypes of HIV, but what we're really thinking about, in the United States, we have a single subtype. And what we're really considering is the activity of the HIV medications against the virus. So HIV can vary from person to person, and as I mentioned, over time you might pick up a drug resistance mutation to 1 or 2 medications. But in 2019 we have more than 20 available HIV medications, so it's really just a matter of going into it cautiously and with a full evaluation. As I mentioned in Nina's case, it was fairly simple and straightforward, so I am hoping that this leads to a ripple effect, and many people living with HIV will be inspired to register as organ donors as a result.
Great. And Dr. Segev, were there any special considerations in advance of the surgery or during the surgery in this situation?
Well, when somebody donates a kidney, the most important thing that we think about is, can they live the rest of their long and healthy life with only 1 kidney? And we do a ton of different screening tests, and we make sure that they don't have the types of conditions or diseases that would lead them down the road to have trouble with their kidney. And as I said, we base this now on science of tens of thousands of people with HIV, millions of people who don't have HIV, hundreds of thousands of people who've donated kidneys. And we put all of this science together to sort of calculate what we think the risk is. So always that's our first and foremost concern. Our second concern is to make sure that we think that they can tolerate the operation of having their kidney out. in general, if you've passed the first set of screening, you will pass the second screen as well. With somebody like Nina, who's young and who's in great cardiovascular health, there's not any, there's never zero risk, but that risk is about as low as it can possibly be. The nice thing is that once she passed this screening, the operation itself of taking her kidney out was exactly the same as the first several hundred times that I did this operation. So we do this, every week, and it was no different from any other live donation in somebody who doesn't have HIV. And that's what makes it magical, that now anybody can do this anywhere in the world, provided that they screen the patients accordingly, and that they know. That the patients know what their risks are that they're getting themselves into. One thing that's really inspired me is that when we talk to people who donate kidneys and we ask them what their motivations are, in general, the motivation is that they love their family member or their loved one or their friend and they want to help, etc. We've done studies, Christina's done studies of people living with HIV and asked them, would you be a kidney donor, and why would you want to be a kidney donor? And in addition to this dimension of, I want to take care of a single individual person, we've heard all sorts of really inspiring things, sort of like what Nina was talking about as well, of people wanting to do this out of solidarity to the HIV community, out of celebrating the fact that we've really almost defeated this disease, that today, somebody with HIV does not look like somebody who's sick, who's battling a disease. Somebody with HIV looks like a marathon runner who, has a graduate level training in public health and understands the HIV epidemic better than most people do. This is what HIV looks like today. And to realize that in doing this donation was really exciting.
That's fantastic. Dr. Durand, how many lives could potentially be saved by now having live organ transplants as well as deceased organ transplants?
Well, I mean, we'll find out. I think there's potentially tens of thousands of people living with HIV like Nina who are otherwise healthy, and if they are so inspired and motivated, there could be thousands of lives saved. There are many people on the wait list who are in need of an organ, and so this is a great opportunity.
Wonderful. So, Nina, you were inspired by a friend to donate. What advice would you now give to other people who are watching and thinking, I could do this?
Well, first and foremost, you have to hydrate well. And even if you think you're well hydrated, hydrate some more. I think at one point, someone was telling me that I shouldn't live in the desert because I dehydrate easily, and I said, well, I live in the South where it's 2 showers a day in the summer, so it's not much better. But it's a long and arduous process. I think in some ways being an HIV patient prepared me for such a long and arduous evaluation. Even if it might seem that it will last forever, the evaluation does not. But it's honestly because they're screening you so closely just to make sure that later on down the line, you don't run into trouble with your remaining kidney by losing a kidney. You have to be healthy enough to lose a kidney. And for me to even just pass the evaluation was kind of the goal. I was very excited that day, and everything else was just kind of a bonus. I neglected to mention that the friend I started this for, he did pass away. He was only on the wait list where he lived for 2 months before he passed away the day after Thanksgiving. And honestly, knowing the cost of healthcare, I knew that this was a lot of medical spending to not continue the rest of the way, especially since I had received donor approval to go ahead and donate this organ. And as we know, that there is no shortage of need. So for anyone considering embarking on this journey, it is doable. I've just showed you how, and I'm very excited to see who the first follower might be.
Great. Let's go to the phone one more time. Deja, are there any questions?
We do have a question from the line of Heather Broner with Medscape. Please go ahead. Heather, your line is open. You may be muted. All right. Well, again, if there are any questions, please press star and then 1.
Okay, so we'll wait for Heather to get back on the line. Nina, talk to me about, you've mentioned that we've talked about your training in public health and your interest as a medical volunteer for so long. There's still a bit of a stigma around HIV infection and living with HIV, despite all the treatments available and how, you know, people are living healthy, full lives now. Talk to me about, you know, what you hope your involvement here might do for the community and for how others perceive HIV infection.
I mean, even though a lot of kidney donors have personal motivations for donating a kidney because they know who they intend to donate to, for me, it was just kind of an opportunity to be the same as anybody else. I really felt like, particularly since I live in the southern United States, where attitudes around HIV are still pretty dated, I really wanted to do something to kind of jolt people's perceptions. And again, as Dr. Segev said, that usually when society thinks of people living with HIV, they think of people who look like they have HIV, that they think of people from the 1980s. And part of the appeal of this process was I got to be rigorously tested. I mean, I had been medically followed by the National Institutes of Health, so I had a pretty good idea of where I stood. But to be able to leave this kind of medical legacy for me was quite important, because I wanted to show that people living with HIV were just as healthy, and participating in this study did help me do that. And I think as someone who received a blood transfusion, who ultimately did get HIV from that transfusion, the point is that that blood saved my life, and somebody was waiting for a kidney who needed that kidney, and even though my kidney has HIV, you know, this kidney saved their lives. And there's just so much positivity to this story that I just very simply wanted to show that I was just as like anybody else.
Great. Let me see. Do we have any other questions, Deja?
We did get the line of Heather back. One
great.
moment. Your line is now open, Heather.
Hi, this is Heather. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. To the doctors, I write for physicians, so can you talk to me a little bit about how you expect this live transplant to change practice, or what would you say to providers about what this might mean in practice going forward?
I think one main message is that people that they're taking care of who are living with HIV, if they get kidney failure or liver failure, we can transplant them. And so transplantation is no longer, HIV is no longer a contraindication to transplantation in any way. In addition, people living with HIV who have loved ones or family members or friends who they want to donate a kidney to now can do so. They need to be very carefully screened, but the doors are now open for people living with HIV to become kidney donors. And that's, I think, important for any physician across the United States to be aware of.
Yeah, we know, I mean, there's hundreds of people, thousands of people living with HIV who have end-stage organ disease and could benefit from a transplant. But there are still barriers to getting them to transplant, and some of that is their physicians aren't referring them, they think they can't get a transplant. And so I think, as Dory said, we really want people to know, if you're living with HIV and you have kidney disease, you should explore transplantation. And then I think the other part that we see is people living with HIV on the transplant wait list face higher risk of death. And so for many of them, they don't have living donors, and this potentially will open the door for patients who have higher need.
But dissemination of this information is really important. The HOPE Act passed in 2013. As of 2013, it was possible for people living with HIV to sign their donor cards, to get their heart on their driver's license. And even today, when we go to conferences or to meetings of people living with HIV, we are surprised by how few people are aware that that's the case. So I think physicians taking care of the 1 million+ patients living with HIV in the United States can help us by disseminating that information as well.
Right.
Lenny Bernstein of the Washington Post has a question for you. Could the doctor speak a little bit about immunosuppressant drugs and HIV medication, and whether or not there's any impact of combining those for the recipient?
Yeah, so when we went into HIV transplantation in the early 2000s, people were worried about giving someone living with HIV a transplant and then requiring them to take immunosuppressant medications to prevent rejection. They were worried potentially these patients would end up with more infections. But that actually was not the case. We were surprised. They did not have increased infections, and they had excellent outcomes. So we do have to do a little bit of work in terms of drug-drug interactions, but that has also become much easier with newer HIV medications, and I think that is not a barrier to transplantation any longer in this population. We can manage those things.
Yeah, and I think it's a good reminder that if you have HIV but it's well controlled and you are on antiretroviral therapy, you don't have an immune deficiency syndrome. You just have HIV, hiding in your body somewhere, but that's completely controlled. And as a result, you have a fully functioning immune system. We can give people immunosuppression. Today, with modern immunosuppression and modern antiretroviral medication, there are very few drug-drug interactions from that as well. And so that also helps us maintain adequate immunosuppression levels in those patients.
Great. Yvonne from Agence France Presse asks if you anticipate doing transplants of any other organs, and do you have the authorization to do so? I know, Dr. Durand, you have NIH funding to look at both kidney and liver transplantation in patients, but could you tell us a little bit more about other types of organs maybe?
Yeah, so the HOPE Act, the HIV Organ Policy Equity Act, did not restrict to any organs. So as far as the HOPE Act is concerned, we can transplant organs from any organ from a donor with HIV to a recipient with HIV. On the living donor side, kidney has really been the challenge because we were worried that down the road donors might be at risk of kidney disease attributable to the HIV or the antiretroviral therapy. Living donor liver transplantation is also a possibility in the United States, and our doors are certainly open for doing something like this, and there are other doors across the United States that are open for that as well. So it's just a matter of finding the right people to donate.
Follow-up question: how many people living with HIV could currently be on the waiting list for organ transplant?
So that's a great question. We actually don't exactly know the answer to that question because for many years HIV status wasn't collected on the transplant wait list. But if you do some back of the envelope calculations, we estimate there's probably around 10,000 people living with HIV who are on dialysis with end-stage kidney disease. So.
Yeah, and that's another great example of the change of the role of HIV. So years ago, HIV was considered such a stigmatized disease that people would not collect and report the HIV status of people on the waiting list because it wasn't relevant to what kind of organ they got, and it wasn't considered reasonable to collect and store this information. Today, HIV is a completely different disease, and we need to know that because we need to know whether they can accept a donor with HIV, which, again, years ago was not even considered a possibility.
Right. From Periscope, we have a question. Was this covered by insurance? And if not, where did the funding come from?
Yeah, so all kidney transplants in the United States are covered by insurance. If not private insurance, then Medicare, because Medicare covers all end-stage kidney disease care, including dialysis and transplantation. On the donor side, the recipient's insurance always covers the donor's medical expenses. And so even donors who don't have their own medical insurance, their costs are covered by the recipient's insurance.
Right. Let's check with the phone again. Deja, do we have any questions?
We do have a few questions. Our first question will come from Errol Barnett with CBS News.
Hey there. My question was for Nina. Nina, you spoke about your journey through this, almost beginning with your intent to donate a kidney to a friend of yours who died after Thanksgiving. Could you just talk to us about the emotional side of, for you as the donor, having made an initial plan, that plan changing, and now the outcome being what it is now, what it's been like for you?
I mean, obviously, losing somebody to both HIV and kidney disease was very hard. But my late friend was very excited to embark on this journey together. So even though I was a number of months into the evaluation, really I just carried on in honoring him, because I knew that even though we weren't physically together, we still kind of ended up doing this together, because if it weren't for his ask for a kidney, it wouldn't have been a serious consideration in my mind. It was something that I had been thinking about, but unless somebody is expressing a need for a kidney, I didn't really have any way of acting on it. So while it's bittersweet that I could not give my kidney to who I wanted to give it to, I know that my late friend would be glad to have known that I still proceeded with donation anyway.
All right, and our next question will come from Heather Broner with Medscape.
Thank you. Can you give me a sense of how the recipient is doing and when you'll know that the transplant was accepted?
The recipient's doing great, and the recipient will likely be discharged from the hospital in the next couple of days, so already going well.
Again, if there are any questions, you can press star and then 1. We do have a question from the line of Jeff Berry with Positively Aware Mag. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Nina. Thank you for your story and for your courage. And I wondered if there was one thing maybe that surprised you or was unexpected, either during the course of the evaluation or the transplantation itself. And also just for the doctors, I know that 10 or 15 years the recipient may need another transplant. Is that typically covered by the same insurance?
Do you want to start with surprises?
Sure.
Just one.
I mean, aside from my friend passing away, that was definitely unexpected. I think the next thing I sort of didn't expect, even though when you're rigorously evaluated, you're going to find things that you didn't expect. So for me, I didn't realize that the kidney I donated had a kidney stone in it and had some small cysts on it, things that I would have normally thought would preclude donation, but they, did their tests and concluded that I could still donate. So things that I thought would have precluded me from donation did not. And so that's something that I would generally tell other people is don't disqualify yourself. Let the evaluation process and the physicians do that for you. So even if you think going in, oh, I could never be a donor, I would just ask you to call a transplant center and get information for yourself and let them do the disqualifying.
Yeah. Or qualifying.
Or qualifying.
Yeah.
Qualifying. In terms of the longevity of the organ and the recipient, actually today, with a living donor transplant, particularly from somebody as healthy as Nina, we expect that kidney to last somewhere on the order of 20 to 40 years. It's very difficult to estimate, obviously, because it depends on the donor and the recipient and changes in healthcare and our ability to treat transplant patients. But today, the estimate is about 20 to 40 years on that kidney. So hopefully, this recipient will never need another kidney transplant. But if the recipient does happen to need another transplant, in general, they continue to be covered by insurance, and insurance will pay for second, third transplants, et cetera. So there's a whole system for maximizing the amount of time that somebody can be off of dialysis.
Great. Are there any other questions from the phone line?
There are no questions in queue at the moment.
Could you talk, doctors, a little bit more about antiretroviral therapies, drug levels? I know we had a question about this earlier, but if the donor and the recipient are on different drug regimens, how is that handled? Are there any risks associated with that?
Today's antiretroviral therapy is so good that patients take usually a single pill once a day that's expected to really have no side effects and very few toxicities. So this concept of superinfection and making sure things match up sounds complex, but given the advances we've had, it's relatively straightforward. We usually change the recipient's medications after the transplant because they now have a functioning kidney, which is a good thing. So we might do a little small changes, but it's relatively straightforward.
That's great.
Yeah.
Now, Nina, you had mentioned that you thought the screening process would never end, and your advice to potential donors was that, the end, there is an end. What exactly was that like for you? You had to travel to Johns Hopkins, you live in Atlanta. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Sure. Well, for 3 of the months that I was under evaluation, I was actually training for last year's Marine Corps Marathon. So part of that delay was for me, but that's kind of the benefit of living donation, is that it does work around the donor schedule. And then I didn't even end up running the marathon because I got sick right at my evaluation visit with Dr. Duran. So I do have a deferral to this year's Marine Corps Marathon, which I will endeavor with my 1 remaining kidney. I just didn't know anything about organ donation. This was such a new a field for me to explore. Honestly, you're going to be thoroughly tested, and you're going to be following those test results pretty religiously, but I just let them tell me what they think that means, and I just got a lot of gratification from it because I was putting time and effort into this process, and I was getting good positive feedback and going through the different stages of testing. And again, this was a donation decision that I made, and I was just very determined to see it through. I did after we hit 6 months, I got my little heart on my state ID to say that I was a deceased donor to mark the occasion, but had this lasted a lot longer, I could see the wait being a little bit difficult, so I'm glad that we were able to make this donation happen when it did.
Great. And from the provider point of view,
Nina was a very patient and also a very well-informed patient. I mean, she was, knew every detail about her medical history, and the physicians who take care of her locally were excellent. We wanted to be very careful and make sure that this was, everything was in place going forward. I remember I saw you after the surgery and said, "How was that?" And Nina said that was the easiest part. It was way easier than the evaluation. So, it was the world's first, and we wanted to take our time and take care, and different things popped up along the way, but overall, I think it was a success. So.
Right.
Yeah, in a way, it kind of makes me feel better to hear that somebody was surprised by how careful we were and how meticulous we were in the screening evaluation, because that's how we want to be. We want to make sure that when we say to somebody, it's okay for you to give up one of your kidneys, that we're saying to them, for everything we know and can estimate, your lifetime risk of developing kidney failure in your remaining kidney is as close to 0 as it can be, right? It's extremely low. If it were high, we would tell people, no, maybe donation is not the right thing for you to do. And so obviously in all donors, in general, we have a lot of testing that we want to do, and we want to make sure that we screen from top to bottom any potential diseases and conditions and family history that they might have. And then in particular, when you add the excitement and challenge of the first time this is ever being done anywhere in the world, we're going to be obviously extra meticulous about it. But it felt great to know that Nina's care of her HIV was exceptional, and her care of herself and her health, and she's a marathon runner, she runs farther than I can ever hope to run, that made her all the better of a candidate, particularly to be the first.
Right. And now with 1 remaining kidney that's highly functional, are there any special considerations for marathon training and staying hydrated? And the Marine Corps is usually, in October?
Right.
So
I have some time.
Yeah.
Camelback.
I actually do know people who have donated kidneys who are marathon runners and do all kinds of endurance sports. Last year, somebody I know who had donated ran the Marine Corps Marathon, and her recipient to whom she donated also ran the marathon. So you had two one-kidney people running the marathon. I think her right kidney is the one she donated. It had a faster personal record time than her left, which was hers. So I'm looking forward to seeing if there's an improvement on my time, but really I'm just running to finish and just to have that novelty of being a one-kidney marathoner with HIV.
Any calls on the line?
We do have a few. We have one from the line of Heather Broner with Medscape.
Hi, I'm sorry, I keep asking you all the questions. Dr. Segev, you said that there now people with HIV can get that heart on their licenses and sign up to be organ donors, but my understanding is that in a couple of states it's still a felony to donate your organ if you are living with HIV. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so the federal law, the HIV Organ Policy Equity Act, allows donation of organs for people who have HIV. There are some, what happened was in the 1980s when the original law banned this, a lot of states had put together state laws that reflected the original laws. And now the federal law changed, but the state laws did not change in some places. And the states are moving very quickly to change those laws to be consistent with the federal law. I would say that anybody living with HIV, it's totally fine to sign your donor card. There's nobody that's going to get in trouble for signing their donor card. Now, whether in that state, if they happen to die at a time where there is still a state law in effect, whether it would be legal for the doctors in that state to recover those organs. In some states, those laws may not have fully changed yet, but we are seeing all of the states move quickly to make the state laws match the federal laws. So I would still very clearly put out there that anybody living with HIV can and should sign their donor card.
Yeah, several states have already overturned the antiquated legislature, California, New Jersey. And so, as Dory usually offers, if that's a situation that you get into, just call us and we'll try to help you fix it in real time.
Yeah.
So.
That's right. Call us at Johns Hopkins.
All right, and our next question will come from the line of Ivan Karoni with AFP. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Now, are you allowed to do transplants as early as this year? I mean, routinely, and how many do you expect to realistically to do by the end of the year, for instance?
Just to clarify, do you mean living donor HIV to HIV transplants?
The same kind of transplants you did.
Yeah, so, Nina has now broken ground on this, and obviously we would very carefully evaluate any other heroes and brave people living with HIV who want to be among the first group who have done this. We don't really know how many we anticipate done by the end of the year. As with everything else, the adoption curve sort of starts slowly and at some point hits an inflection point and then becomes more active. We've seen that in every innovation we've been a part of in transplantation, and I suspect we'll see that with this innovation as well. We already have phone calls since Nina was approved to be a donor of people living with HIV who would like to be living donors, and I suspect that, and I hope that across the country, transplant centers will have the same experience, and I think it will grow, but it will grow slowly, and as you can imagine, until a few people have done this, everybody's going to be quite careful with donor selection, so the donor selection today may be more stringent than it would be in 5 years when we have a lot more information.
And do you have any contact with doctors in other countries who are interested? And can we expect this to develop outside of the U.S.?
I certainly hope so. I think in most places, if HIV to HIV transplants are legal, then living donation is also legal. There are still some countries where use of HIV-positive organs is illegal, and we've had our colleagues contact us and get advice on how to move legislation forward in their country as well. But I think for the most part, people were waiting for the first one to happen, And once the first one happens, and we can see by looking at Nina today that that it's safe to do, and as we learn more, I think people from other countries will follow in line as well. We have certainly discussed the possibility of this and the research that we did on the 40,000 plus people with HIV in international conferences, and I think that people are planning to do this as well.
Thank you.
Are there other questions on the line?
And again, if there are any other questions, please press star and then 1.
We did get a tweet from Jude Lavelle at NIAID News, which is a part of the National Institutes of Health, who says, "Congratulations, Nina, and good luck on your next marathon." So, congratulations.
And thank you to NIAID for funding all of the research that we have ongoing on HIV-to-HIV transplants.
Are there organs from deceased donors with HIV currently being transplanted to patients without HIV?
So we haven't moved into that territory yet. And I think, part of that is there's plenty of patients living with HIV on the transplant list in need. So we haven't moved there, but that may be the future.
Mm-hmm. And are patients with HIV still eligible then for healthy kidneys now that we've opened this up to having HIV organs available?
Well, so let's clarify that Nina's kidney, who came from a donor living with HIV, is a healthy kidney.
Yeah.
I think the answer to the question was, do people who have HIV on the waiting list, are they still eligible for kidneys from donors who do not have HIV? And that is absolutely true. We have a waiting list in this country. There are more than 100,000 people on that waiting list, and every time somebody from the top gets transplanted, everybody moves forward, and anyone on that waiting list is eligible for any HIV-negative organ that becomes available.
And the HOPE Act really helps everyone on the wait list, regardless of whether you have HIV or not, because of that. So.
Right. So what's next on the research frontier? So Dr. Segev, you mentioned early on that we're very close to a cure. There are people living healthy, long lives with HIV. And now we have broken the ground as far as living donor transplants, kidney transplants for HIV. So what do you see is coming down the pike for organ transplant for HIV and Hep C, other viral infections?
I mean, I think this is a nice intersection of an advance in transplantation and one in HIV care as well. And I think Christine would be great to talk about some of the things that we're learning about HIV care and potentially HIV cure from the fact that we're doing these trials in HIV-to-HIV transplants.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was nice to see NIAID tweeting out to us, but we do have to thank them. So, we started Hope in Action as a small pilot study in 2016, but now NIH is funding 2 larger trials of deceased donor kidney and liver transplantation. And of course, we're going to learn lots about transplant outcomes from those trials. But we're also excited because I think we're going to contribute to understanding of HIV more broadly. And in particular, there's a lot of emphasis right now on finding a cure for HIV. That's one of the top research priorities. And I think we can learn from the patients in our trial more about long-lived HIV reservoirs. There are interesting therapies that are used for immunosuppression that may actually reduce HIV reservoirs. And also because we're doing transplants in so many patients living with HIV, we're able to get lymph nodes and unique tissues. So we have a lot of very exciting studies that we're doing with our colleagues in HIV virology and immunology. And we hope to learn more beyond just transplantation.
And what is enrollment like for these studies? Are medical volunteers easy to come by? Are people willing to participate in trials? Are there any challenges in doing that?
So these trials are for people living with HIV who are in need of transplant. But as a general principle, people living with HIV are very committed to research trials. When we did some of the work Dory was talking about, we talked to people living with HIV about their attitudes about donation. We found many of them wanted to be donors, and one of the motivations for donation was contributing back to science. So certainly we always have excited volunteers. But within these transplant trials, enrollment is going strong. Johns Hopkins was the first center, but we're not the only center. We're working with more than 20 other transplant centers across the U.S. now. So patients in any state likely have a Hope and Action center near them, and they can, if they need a transplant, reach out to their transplant centers and become a part of this effort going forward.
What's your recommendation to get more people involved?
I think for a lot of people, seeing is believing. Having watched the previous press conference with deceased donation and the impact that that made, I did notice that, you know, the patients who received these organs were not a part of the press conference. So that's why it was very important for me to sit here today so that people could see that, you know, I just had surgery this week. I just had a kidney removed. I look great. I'm going to be vain and take that moment for a second. I look like the best HIV positive kidney donor the country has ever seen today. And, you know, if people need that visual cue to be motivated to donate, like I'm willing to do it. I think it's very educational for us to be sitting here today and having these conversations, because there's a lot that people don't know about HIV. There's a lot that people don't know about organ transplantation. And so I think that the first thing people should do is like talk to their physician. I talked to my personal physician years ago about this opportunity, and she was just really willing to entertain those conversations and hear me out. And I bet that she did not think that 3 years later that she would be watching the news clips about her patient, you know, becoming the first living kidney donor. So if you have questions, I just encourage people to talk to their local transplant center, talk to their physician, and just get that information that you need to make a well-informed medical decision, because that's what I did, and that's how we're here today.
Any other calls on the line?
At the moment, there are no questions in queue.
How about online on Periscope? Alrighty, so thank you everyone for tuning in today. Dr. Segev is available for media interviews until 3 o'clock.
And then after 5:30.
And then after 5:30 today, and Dr. Durand is available today until 5 o'clock for media interviews. To schedule any interviews, please email jhmedia@jhmi.edu. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and we will sign off. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody on the line. Thank you to the crew. Thank you for everybody on Periscope. Yay.
We did it.